I would say part of what it has been really kind of like amazing, at least, with the way we live our lives, is that ability, that unique ability to actually work through that fear through this art that we create.
Welcome, friends. I'm Kristen Martin, and this is Torches. Today, we have the wildly inventive Clint Ramos. Clint is a creative director, designer, advocate, and producer. I'm really excited to speak with him today. Welcome, Clint.
Hi, Kristen.
Yay, so good to see you.
So good to see you, too.
So, how did you come to be in downtown performance originally?
Oh, my gosh. Well, I moved to the States from the Philippines in the 90s, in the mid-90s. And so really a lot of my friends or the people I met worked downtown, and I also, for a period of time, I worked under Ellen Stewart, and really when I say work, sweeping floors, and you know what I mean,
right.
Running laundry, the dry cleaning and all that stuff. But anyway, I had been working with Mai, Ralph, Pena. Those were my first few jobs, and a lot of the circles like Ching Valdez and all of those folks really worked downtown. And then I ended up going to grad school at NYU. So it was just kind of the center of my world, really.
You've spoken a lot about the importance of story in your work. Can you talk about why that is central to you?
Well, this is why we do it, right? Mm-hmm. I feel I think with everything that we do, regardless of venue or size or scale, I feel like the reason why we do what we do is that we need a container for these stories, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that as human beings, it's just necessary for us to work through all of that. And I think I think about this a lot now that I have a kid, mm-hmm. And she's 8, and there are so many new emotions and feelings, mm-hmm. and all of it, everything is new for mm-hmm. her, and when I say new, really for the first time in her life, she's experiencing it. And I look back at why do we do art? Why do we create these things? And it's really it more than any other point in my life, having a child really puts that in perspective, oh, right, we need containers for these things. So mm-hmm. others, who may have experienced it or are experiencing whatever that is, can actually refer to those containers and say, oh, look at this. Here's this thing that this person created, and it contains the thing that I'm experiencing. And it's really about that,
That's beautiful. You spoke about the different size of venues, you've worked in the smallest downtown spaces, you've worked in Broadway houses and opera houses, in the plaza of Lincoln Center. How does working at those different scales and in those different spaces affect your visioning?
I think the visioning, at least the early part of the visioning is really kind of, it doesn't, the scale doesn't affect it, right? I think it's about what story we're telling. But then I think once you get into building the thing, it does affect it in many ways, both in resources and scale and all of that. But the impetus of the idea, the story that we're trying to tell remains the same.
You work with a lot of different folks in different contexts too, so collaboration is obviously a big part of what you have to do, adapting to different dynamics and different situations. What is exciting to you about collaboration, and what makes it really, what's one that makes it truly generative? What's an element that makes it truly a generative experience?
I think it really is this kind of freedom, and to me it's about that collision of ideas, right? Mm-hmm. And running the risk of discord, really, and I think that's kind of important. I feel I think those conversations, those collaborative conversations when we create, are when I feel most free. Mm-hmm. And I feel most free because we are we are trying to move each other, to create this thing, right? Yeah. And in that sort of kind of like effort to move each other, you run the risk of offending each other. And I always feel like, I think if we apply that to sort of like what we share with an audience, right? And if we are expecting whatever work we come up with to move that audience, there is a risk of offending them. And I think those are, and I say that because I think it's really important, like collaboration as a construct is really interesting, right? But what a lot of folks don't maybe think about is that you are approaching these collaborations as human beings with all of the baggage that you're coming in, right? And your perspective in life. And yet somehow there is a shared, you come up with a shared vision, something that has been distilled that really triggers your common humanity that I think is most exciting. I don't think I've ever experienced that in any sort of like group or any kind of like life endeavor, really, you know?
Right. And you keep expanding your roles. You know, you came in as a designer, and then you've been exploring obviously costumes and scenery, but now creative producing, and now thinking of creative direction, and an advocate for us all. So talk a little bit about what's growing for you.
I think we all do it in many ways, right? I feel like they always call me like, you know, someone who doesn't stay in their lanes, and even like even in close collaborations, like, you know, like when I'm designing, like I'm always at the lighting table, or I'm always, you know, with the director. And I feel like, I think for me it was just a natural progression of like I want to kind of like do all of these things. Like time is so finite, you know, and in many ways there were things that I felt like, oh, I could probably make this happen faster if I either advocated for it, or if I were in a position in the sort of like structure that we've constructed for ourselves, right? If I were in a position to actually affect more change in many ways, you know. And so that's really how it kind of like evolved, you know. And then I think with most of us, we collaborate with friends who believe in the same thing that you do, and they, you know, they transform or transition into positions, and they invite you, and I just basically just say yes. That's really what it is. I just say yes. I'll do that. I'll do that. You know, it's mostly that. And I found it, you know, I talk a lot about this with designers, right? And there's a tendency for us to get so siloed. You know, we get divided into disciplines. You know, we kind of, you know, at production meetings, it's like by department and all that. But it kind of really stifles all of the other impulses that designers have, you know. And I think this is in general with all theater artists. You know, I think what we learn in the theater and the performing arts through all of that collaboration are like these extreme like organizational and leadership skills that I feel like is not tapped into, you know. I was talking to David Zinn actually about this, and at the height of our busyness, we were doing 20 to 25 shows a year, all over the country.
I can't believe you two were managing that. And you were doing a bunch together, too.
Correct. And so
I worked with both of you at here in the early years.
And we were just saying what a privilege it was to go into an institution as an outsider and somehow pinpoint things that made the machine within that institution serve the vision of that particular production in a matter of weeks. So in many ways, when you look at artists who are like itinerant, you know, I mean, we always think of ourselves like, you know, we're really kind of like migrant workers in many ways, right? But like what that has given us was this ability to actually pinpoint and diagnose things. Very specific things.
Yes.
Right? But that could be helpful in sort of creating this sort of like bigger leadership and organizational model, you know.
Yeah, you hit on a few things I'm really interested in. I'm going to hop ahead a little to institutions because you're talking about that right now. So how have you found institutions served or didn't serve your work?
Oh my gosh. You know, gosh, that is a hard question to answer because it also depends on what institution it is. You know, I find that the institutions that have been most helpful are the institutions that have been most limber in terms of organizational structure. Right. I mean, clearly there has to be a structure within an institution. But I also feel like I think a lot of artists come to an institution with applying their own rubric, for that institution. And I think it's most effective when we also are limber, when we approach it and say, oh, right, this home functions this way. The bathroom is over there, and that flush actually, it's not it's up there. You know what I mean? Like, it's that kind of thing. And I feel like, I think when we have an aligned kind of like ethos of like, oh, right, we are strangers to each other, I think that's most effective. The institutions that have not been so effective, at least in my own process, is an institution, those institutions that feel like it is more institution forward than art forward, where boards are structured to keep, and I'm not saying that this is not important, right? But at the fore of the board's mind is really kind of like survival, fiscal survival, and I think that's really where, and I understand it all, and I think part of when you talk about efficacy, as far as like creating art is concerned, it really boils down to how limber are you, I
think so. I think that probably is the answer to this next question, which is like, if you could change one thing about institutions, what would it be? And it sounds like it's flexibility.
Flexibility.
Right. Yeah.
Listen, I feel like, I think it's hard, right? Because like, as like activists, we always say like, oh, right, this is so capitalist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's also kind of naive to think that we exist in a vacuum, that we don't exist in this sort of like capitalist country, right? That have created values, whether or not it's a not-for-profit, that have created values based on that capitalist ethos,
Right.
And that's not incidental. It's just like the way we have to do it, the way we raise money, right? The way we get support and all of that. So I think it's really about like, hey, taking a step back and saying, okay, great, this is sort of like the thing that we must do and that we have to do, or the easiest way to do it. But then how can we also be, I don't know, explore other ways, or within that kind of like structure, how can we create the most art that we can create?
How has access to resources affected your work?
Access to resources is a great thing. It has affected it in a way that you could certainly scale up, But also part of that is that I think the thing that we don't think about is that like more resources means there's more underpinning under it, right? And so there are more people involved. There are more, departments to. Just more boxes to tick off. It's a larger marketing structure. There's like so many more departments. A lot of middle management folks who do that. And sometimes I think, and I've learned this kind of like really sort of the hard way, is that it is easy to get lost in that big machine. In a big machine, more resources means the machine is bigger. Yeah. Right, and then through that kind of like forest, it's hard to find the sort of original germ. In many ways, these days, when I'm not like running around, the thing that I enjoy most is working with my hands, because it hasn't, it's very rare that I get to do that now, and that sort of like kind of, I think, mirrors what your question about like, well, what does like access to resources actually create, right? It just creates more work, really. More work that's not necessarily all directly, there's not a direct conduit to the work itself.
I get you.
Yeah.
So how do you keep your experimentation and your creativity outside of that commodification pressure?
Oh my gosh, this is a really good question, and I talk about this a lot. Like when people ask me, how do you parent and all that kind of stuff. I stay up late. Like I literally. Before I got married, before kids, before like really like, adulting, there was like, there's kind of like freedom to be to somehow be timeless. And that part of that is youth too, right?
Yes.
Like, time just moved so slowly back then, and like now it's so fast. But I also feel like I think part of what I've been trying to do is really regain some of that back. I know that I can't I can't go back in time, but what I can do is carve out a little time where I'm free to do whatever I want. And most of the time, this happens like late at night, like when I put my kid to bed and my husband like says, "Are you coming to bed?" And I always say no. Like, no, and then I spend like two hours a night really just going into those rabbit holes, trying to spark another dream, really. And that's kind of like the thing that, and I'm willing to sacrifice sleep for that. That's like, a big thing for me. And as you said, like, the big challenge now is to convince, in sort of like my curatorial role, my producing role, is to convince artists that, regardless of the sort of like size of the resources and whatever, that there is this kind of like period that don't require a lot of resources, of dreaming and figuring out this kind of organism that you're going to create that's super, super exciting. And that should be a marked thing in one's psyche, because that is the magnet that you always come back to. And I like that. And I think as long as I'm alive, I would want that period of time just to myself, to do that dreaming and creating and figuring out that organism.
Right. Right. I wanted to hop back to you mentioned that you moved here from the Philippines.
Yes, yeah.
So has your identity affected your aesthetic and your way of thinking?
It's so funny. I moved here very young. I moved here like 18. Like I finished college early, and so I came. My professors there were, if you really want to do this, go to America or go to England, whatever. But my roots in performance really is from political street theater. I was a kid. Right. I was a high school kid who met this drama teacher who brought me to these like protest performances. And so when I came to the States, I both had like this kind of expectation of what theater could be. But what I didn't expect really was like, oh, right, like all of a sudden I'm brown. I never really considered that, right?
Yes.
Like, like I come from a homogenous society, we diverse, but very, So in many ways, I've had to kind of like, at least in the early part of like my grad school and the early part of my career, I've had to put a lot of things about my sort of like, what I think is my root identity on the shelf. Some part of it, to just really become a sponge to absorb all of the things. And funnily enough, like maybe, 5 years before the pandemic, I would even say a little earlier, things started to fall off the shelf. Like things started to kind of gnaw at me in a very kind of existential way. And like, why does this feel not right? Why does this, why? And this is like down to just really looking at a work that I've done and feeling like, it feels like something's off, and that started me on this whole journey, and I'm still on it, of like, oh right, like I have to unlearn a bunch of things that sponge absorbed to get back to that root. Not because it wasn't valid, not because it wasn't like awesome. Like I had amazing teachers, right? But what they were teaching me was what they knew, right? Based on their own root identity. Clearly our identities transform. We acquire more as human beings, right? Like we become parents, we become partners, we become all of that kind of stuff that create our whole thing. And for me at least, as far as like being an immigrant and being a migrant really, I wanted to go back to that. And it felt like that was what was the itch that I needed to scratch, this thing that was gnawing at me, A concrete example of that is like when I was going to design school, at least during that time, all of my teachers, masters at the craft, were telling me, every time I brought in work, they would be like, it's too busy. There's too many things happening. And I always just took that to heart. Like I said, oh, right. They taught me, at least in my case, it was always about essentializing, distill it to one or two ideas, right? And I never questioned that, Kristen. I never did. And then, many years later, this period that I've been talking to you about, it dawned on me like, oh, right. Like, it wasn't busy. It was complex. I come from a very complex culture. With layers, 3, 4 layers of colonization and all of that. And that is my identity. There is no, whatever it is, I love when folks like try to go back to their indigenous self. It's impossible for me because we have so many layers of that. And it occurred to me that I wasn't able to actually verbalize that, or I wasn't eloquent enough to actually say to my teachers, you know what, this is a different point of view, because I didn't really know.
Yeah.
All I knew was that that wasn't working for them.
Do you think that's different for young designers that are coming up now, or young artists that are coming up now?
I think so.
Because it's a cultural shift that's
It
happened.
is, absolutely. And I envy them.
Yeah.
I envy them. When we were coming up, like, listen, George Wolfe was the first person to hire me out of grad school. And at the Public, there were so many designers who were my peers. We were always told, head down, just keep on working, and then people will look at your work and, try to hire you and all that. But, be sort of like impervious to any sort of stimuli that might harm you or might, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't whatever. And as now that I mentor young folks, like, that argument is not valid anymore. They're like, wait, why do I have to create an armor?
Yeah.
And you can't say, because we were taught to do that.
Right.
It's like, why?
Yeah.
I marvel at the age that they're living, and I marvel at what is, within their reach, and this sort of like cultural shift that they are swimming in.
And did you and David Zen start this thing working with young designers in order to help address the issues you're talking about?
A lot of it, yes.
Yeah.
A lot of like what we discuss. Listen, I think part of like young, we have a program called Springboard to Design for high school students.
Calling all high school students with a passion for the arts.
If you're into drawing,
Painting, photography,
fashion,
cosplay, if you're interested in theater design, set design,
costume design,
lighting design,
sound design, and video design,
then
keep watching.
It's really primarily for high school students who may be curious about design for performance. And it's not to create new designers, it's really to give them, again, a container, because most of the kids that come to our program usually are not, they want to be in that community, they're not really natural performers, so they end up doing sort of auxiliary work around it, right? But yet they're sticking because they like being in that community of creators. And so I think part of what David and I really want to do is like say, hey, you're right, there is a place for you. And you don't necessarily need to go to grad school for it. Right. These are the many ways. Like, we have teachers like machine teachers do what we do, but didn't necessarily go through the sort of like sausage machine. And it's really important. I say this because like day one of that sort of week-long intensive is like a whole session of how to advocate for themselves. And this is, to me, the most wonderful class for them, because like you really see kind of like, oh, right, like this is, they're carrying so much. They're carrying so much of, so much hope, so much kind of like confusion about how to belong, really.
You've done a lot of organizing and advocacy.
Yeah.
Is this where you're centering your work on that right now, or are there other activities that you're engaging in? I think there are.
It's funny because like I think that advocacy also transforms over time, right? And I think when you're young, you really think about like, oh, up the provost, or like, like burn the house down. And I think at least for me, I'm at a point in my life really, also having, again, being a parent, where you kind of like say, hey, can we actually look at this and see, like, do we really need to burn the house down, or do we just need to go and see, like, is this a gut renovation, or do we work on, like, the bathroom now? You know what I mean? And all that. But all of that to say that I think a lot of, like, the kind of advocacy spirit with me is very strong in me, and I apply that to sort of, like, every endeavor within those institutions, And thankfully, I haven't gotten, like, fired. But I think what that kind of, like, downtown, like, mentality, I remember during the pandemic, you and Taylor, like, worked on that amazing advocacy. I think it's just
Trickle Up. I'll just mention it was called Trickle Up.
Amazing.
It's still online for people to check out.
I don't think that that will ever leave me. And so, yes, our Springboard is one of our advocacy. I continue, our advocacy for, really for immigrant designers, particularly during this time. And, really going into these institutions and creating meaningful representation across programming.
Could you talk about your role at Lincoln Center right now?
Yeah. I'm the artist and producer in residence. So this is my first year, and I work very closely with Shanta Thig and Jordana Lee. So I get to program the American Songbook, which I'm in the middle of right now.
And you put an amazing disco ball in the middle of
Yes,
Lincoln Center.
yeah. So I am also the visual director for the Summer for the City Festival, and where we transform the campus. It's been great, and it's been great to be able to actually go outside the bounds of traditional theater or musical theater, or and really create these experiences with artists, and really examine, like, what are we as a performing arts culture society, and what do we want, and and as premier not-for-profit institution for culture and performing arts, what do we want to say in terms of, like, American Songbook is an example, right? And it's such an institution. John Nakagawa started it many years ago, and he retired last year. And because it's such an institution, we haven't really been able to kind of, like, sit back and say, hey, what is the American Songbook? How do we break down those two words, American and Songbook? Who gets to
determine and define,
right? And what is a songbook? Is it a catalog? Is it like is it the list of songs that we've written as Americans over the centuries, or is it also how we create song in this country? And so I'm really interested in those kind of excavations, and I've invited, like, these amazing artists to create these 9 acts across venues to ask the same question.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
Yeah.
You talked about the street theater before.
Yeah.
And at that time, you've talked about you thought the theater could actually be a catalyst for change.
Yeah.
Do you see that happening? Do you think that's so?
I think so. I really do think so. But I think it requires a collective kind of, like, ethos, right? Like, I think that idealism that I've had since moving to this country, it's different. When I was young and I encountered the theater, I saw a direct correlation between those street performances and the revolution that happened in the Philippines. But I do think that what we take for granted in this country is how performance and theater actually is, more than any other media that we consume, is really a venue where you're forced. It's a venue for thought. That you go into the theater and you're literally forced to sit still. If you don't have to sit still, but you're almost like you're kidnapped, right? And I think we as audience members or cultural experiencers never really think, right, this 2.5 hours or 90 minutes, whatever it is the time that I can think, about just really everything, and what's being told in front of me, So yes, I do think it is change starts with thought.
And self-examination.
Yeah.
Mark Bamuti Joseph recently asked, how do we create the conditions for artists to guide us forward to the other side of fear?
Oh, God.
Do you have a reaction to that?
I I don't know how you create and like, you know, the environment or the right sort of like, you know, what it is. It never, because fear is always part of it. And in many ways, I think for me, what has been helpful and has been familiar really is fear. Like if I'm not afraid, then something is wrong. This kind of like, I don't know what the solution is, but I think this kind of philosophy, a shared philosophy somehow that the only way out of fear is through it, right? And that fear actually is not like this thing that will just disappear and dissipate. Like in many ways, we can look at our creative process as like, from conception to rehearsal to opening night, really as like, oh, we're just like, every act that we're doing is chipping away at that fear. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because
fear of failure in
fear
that
of failure,
instance.
fear of that nobody is thinking this except you, right? Like this is not a shared experience. You are a freak. You know what I mean? You are a freak. You are the only one thinking that this is actually a big deal, but it's not. But you know what I mean? But like that's always impossible because there's always a human being out there who's going through the same thing. But I would say part of what it has been really kind of like amazing, at least, you know, with the way we live our lives, is that ability, that unique ability to actually work through that fear through this art that we create. Right? And I think that's the reason why I stay up those 2 extra hours, really, is to kind of like go into those rabbit holes, you know, to really see. I mean, it starts with this, like, again, this feeling, you know, of like, I feel so uncomfortable, or I feel so afraid, or I feel so sad, and I am so afraid that I am the only one who feels this way. And let me figure this out, you know, let me find things, clues, where I'm able to share this, and then that creates another fear of like, okay, if I create this and no one reacts to it, it means that indeed I am a freak, you know. But that never happens, you know what I mean? And so to me, to get to the other side is to really create that work. And so if we are going to create an environment, it is about institutionally, really, it is a yes. Like, yes, experiment with that, do that. Yeah, there are parameters, of course, and all that kind of stuff, but it starts with, can you please follow through, and can you please follow that instinct?
And then on the other side of fear is joy, hopefully.
Yes, so absolute joy. And I mean, I can't even describe the joy. It's like, it's ecstasy, really. I mean, you and I have been in these collective experiences where the audience just is either like caught enraptured by something, or hold their breath collectively, you know, and explode into just like this kind of like applause that is just earth-shattering. That to me is like the biggest high, and in many ways we're just drug addicts chasing that high over and over again, because I cannot describe the amount of joy, but the amount of feeling, this ecstatic feeling that, oh gosh, they all get what we're talking about.
Right.
You know, they're going through it too. You know?
Does that relate to legacy for you? Like, what kind of legacy do you hope your work leaves for audiences, for other artists?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard to think about legacy. If I were to think about legacy, it's really, it's this kind of, I hope I've contributed to this idea that it is a continuum, right? And that it is a life's work, that it is a practice. You know, and that unlike any other practice, it really means that you need to be tapped into your life.
Do you have a thought about sustainable ways for artists to live and thrive that are different than what's happening?
It's so hard because, like, when we were coming up, like, the biggest advice, and this is where I really stumble, biggest advice that I was given was, you know, on a practical level, just keep your overhead low. You know, so I lived in like an SRO, you know, and also I didn't like, I for a long time, I didn't like spend a lot of money on extraneous things. It was really food. And for some reason, you know, and this is not like a badge of honor, you know, I felt sustained both spiritually and physically, really. Also, I was young, I understand. But like, I think, I think for me, the biggest advice that I would say is like really kind of like consider what your rubric of success is.
Mm-hmm.
If that means like fame, fortune, and all that kind of stuff, maybe, maybe it's a different avenue that you need to examine. But if you are like a lot of us, where we were spiritually, because it is a spiritual practice what we do. I'm gonna like claim that, where we felt so spiritually satiated, right? And yet we knew that we were poor. I think that is a beginning of trying to understand what this life is going to be, right? I also feel like there are resources, not so many, but there are resources out there to help you figure out. Listen, when I was coming, I didn't know how to balance a checkbook. Somebody had to teach me from the theater to balance a checkbook. And all my life skills were taught by the community. I'm not even kidding you. Like, parenting,
right?
Trying to figure out what school my kid is going to. Like, if it wasn't for Lynn Nottage giving me a call, like, hey, don't go to this school. All I know in life comes from the community. And I think there's so much community knowledge that we actually take for granted. I think we kind of like say, we apply this sort of same capitalist like rubric of like, here's the ledger sheet, here's a thing, here's a thing, here's a, here's a source of funds that we need to examine, right? When I think there are like little side streets.
Yeah, I mean, I never went to graduate school for arts administration.
There you go, and you ran a major institution.
Right. I always say, the way I learned is I made a mistake, and the lesson is don't make that mistake again.
Correct.
And move on.
Correct. And that's probably one of the biggest advices. Like,
learn in the trenches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Make those mistakes. Make those mistakes and make them, make them once, but make them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it goes back to like the conversation about fear, right? Like it's
The spirit of downtown, do you think it still exists?
Very much. Very much. It's transformed now. I think we talk about downtown in a very kind of like nostalgic way, and I think a lot of like artists, particularly artists who, came up downtown, we wear it with so much pride, as a badge of honor. I like what Patricia McGregor is doing at New York Theatre Workshop right now. It's really rooted in this kind of big, deep social justice way, but also really figuring out, being porous to what's happening in the larger theater ecosystem. I think it is very much alive. I think it is right now responding to the cultural zeitgeist that it's in, I don't think it will ever go away. I think it will transform. I think there's a tendency to keep on institutionalizing things, and I also feel like I think a lot of it has to really do with like technology and what what we have at our sort of like hands, really, in our phones, and if we can somehow figure out a way to get back to the root desire to put something up in a very efficient, very communal, very low resources kind of way, that to me is downtown. And we're doing that uptown too,
Is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to share?
I mean, I love, I think about the work that we've done downtown, the artists that we've met. I was just like thinking about Morgan Jeunesse the other day.
Yeah.
And
I really miss her.
Yeah, when I first started getting sober, I've been sober 25 years, right? Like when I started my recovery journey, Harry Kutakis was like, a very present person. I look at the time when we created work downtown, yes, with like fondness and nostalgia, but like I really look at it as like something that is indelible, and I'm very grateful for, and I am 100% like certain that a lot of artists right now who went through the same creative process downtown will not be the artists that they are. I know it's true for me if it weren't for the work that we created together down there. You know. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Clint.
Thank you, Kristen. This was
joyous.
fun.
Yes. Thanks to HowlRound for hosting us, and we hope you'll come back to more of Torches.